So Charles Spencer just dropped a piece of paper on a Thursday morning that basically did what 30 years of palace PR couldn't do, which is prove that the entire story we were told about Princess Diana and Princess Anne was wrong. Not like partially wrong or missing some details, just completely fundamentally the opposite of what actually happened. And the way it all came out is almost as interesting as what the letter actually says, because the timing of this reveal, the specific details about how the letter was delivered, and the fact that there are apparently 2 copies of this document sitting in different vaults across England, none of that is an accident. This was a coordinated release, and the palace legal team apparently spent an entire night trying to figure out if they could stop it before realizing they had absolutely zero grounds to do anything about it. So let's start with the box, because the visual of this moment is honestly kind of cinematic. Charles Spencer is sitting in the library at Althorp House, which is the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, and if you've ever seen photos of this place, it looks exactly like what you'd imagine an English aristocratic library to look like. Tall windows, thousands of leather-bound books, that specific kind of morning light that makes everything look like a period drama. He's sitting at this heavy walnut desk, and there's a mahogany box that was just retrieved from a secure vault underneath the actual foundation stones of the mansion. Like not a filing cabinet in the basement, a vault under the foundation. He puts on white cotton archivist gloves, which is a detail that matters because it tells you this isn't a casual family photo album situation. This is document preservation protocol. He takes out an iron key, turns it into brass lock, and inside this box lined with faded blue silk is a single sheet of light blue writing paper. And the date on that paper is August 10th, 1997, which, if you know your timeline, is exactly 21 days before Diana died in Paris. That date alone changes the weight of every single word on that page. Before we get deeper into this, if you're enjoying this breakdown and want more royal family analysis, hit that subscribe button and join us here at Crown Watch. We're covering these stories as they develop, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, the letter itself, the paper has the embossed red crest of Kensington Palace at the top, and it's covered in Diana's distinct handwriting using a black rollerball pen. And Charles Spencer didn't just find this and immediately call a press conference. He spent 48 hours working with a senior forensic document examiner from the London Probate Archives to verify that the signature was authentic before he said a single word publicly. They compared the ink pressure points and consistency against hundreds of verified letters in the Spencer family repository, and the verdict came back ironclad that morning. This is Diana's handwriting, Diana's words, Diana's signature. There's no ambiguity here. What she actually wrote is where this story completely dismantles everything we thought we knew about the relationship between these 2 women. For 3 decades, the standard narrative pushed by royal biographers and the press was that Diana and Anne were basically rivals. The framing was always that Diana was this high-fashion, emotionally expressive, media-savvy celebrity princess, and Anne was the no-nonsense, traditional, rural, charity-focused royal who had no patience for any of that. The assumption was that they avoided each other behind closed doors and had nothing in common. This letter proves that during the absolute darkest period of her marital separation, when most of the aristocracy had already dropped her, Diana turned to Anne as her primary source of guidance and protection. Not a friend from her social circle, not a celebrity confidant. The king's sister, and the way she addressed her tells you everything about how close they actually were. Diana didn't use formal aristocratic titles. She addressed Anne simply as Anne, with an intimate tone that apparently exposed how vulnerable she was during that summer of 1997. The letter outlines her growing fear about the rigid institutional protocols being used by senior courtiers to manage the public profiles of her 2 sons, William and Harry. She wrote that she felt an urgent need to build a permanent, independent, protective barrier around the boys' emotional development, and she believed Anne was the only member of the entire Windsor household who had the raw courage to stand against the palace bureaucracy. Think about what that means. Diana looked around at every single person in that family and concluded that the one person who would actually fight for her children was the woman the press kept describing as cold and distant. Now here's where the logistics of this letter get really interesting because Diana didn't just drop it in the regular mail at Kensington Palace. She knew that the Central Palace machinery was monitoring her correspondence during this period, so she used what's being described as a highly secretive informal postal network used by younger members of the aristocracy to bypass the senior courtiers. She instructed her most trusted personal chauffeur to drive the envelope directly to the equestrian stables at Gatcombe Park, which is Anne's private estate, and deliver it by hand to Anne's head groom under strict orders of absolute confidentiality. So this wasn't mailed. It wasn't sent through any official channel. It was hand-delivered to the stables by someone Diana trusted completely, and from there it went directly to Anne's desk. The palace screening machinery never touched it. Charles Spencer apparently gave Clarence House a heads up before this went public. His legal team delivered a high-resolution photocopy of the document to the King's private secretary on Wednesday afternoon as a formal courtesy, giving them a window to review the text before the announcement. And the arrival of that folder triggered what's being described as frantic activity in the palace legal department. Senior solicitors spent the night reviewing the 1993 Royal Trust Acts to see if the Crown had any statutory grounds to file an injunction blocking publication. They ultimately concluded that because the original physical letter was discovered in the private archives of Althorp House, and because it was addressed to a private individual rather than a state official, the Crown had zero constitutional authority to suppress it. It was an independent historical artifact entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Official Secrets Act or the Royal Collection Trust. The palace lawyers had to basically tell the King's advisors, there's nothing we can do here. This is happening. So what was in the letter that made the palace legal team scramble like that? Diana wrote that she had discovered a specific administrative document through a trusted source inside the palace registry office just 48 hours before she sat down to write to Anne. That leaked document detailed a confidential plan by senior court officials to systematically alter her global security arrangements and reduce her personal protection detail to a minimum level, with the goal of pressuring her into surrendering her independent media operations. She explicitly used the phrase administrative trap to describe the legal mechanisms being prepared by the King's solicitors. She explained that the ultimate goal was to use an ancient clause within the 1772 Royal Marriages Act to launch a private custody dispute asserting the sovereign's overriding prerogative to control the education, residence, and daily movements of William and Harry. That's not a vague fear. That's a specific legal strategy she obtained details about. And her primary concern wasn't her own public standing or her travel logistics. She wrote that her deepest fear was the cold institutional environment that would consume her sons if she were suddenly removed from their daily upbringing. She described the senior advisors running the central household as a corporate board of directors who viewed the young princes as functional pieces of state machinery rather than developing human beings who needed genuine parental affection. That's a devastating characterization, and it's made even more devastating by the fact that she was writing this to the King's own sister, essentially saying, your family's apparatus is going to emotionally destroy my children unless someone stops it. The appeal to Anne, specifically, is where the letter apparently becomes almost unbearable to read. Diana wrote that she was begging Anne to look past the superficial court gossip that had been manufactured to divide them over the past decade. She said she chose Anne because Anne was the only member of the Windsor family who possessed the raw courage to look a reigning monarch in the eye and defend the basic human rights of a mother. She wanted Anne to act as an unyielding emotional barrier between her boys and the traditionalists who wanted to shape them into distant, unfeeling symbols of the state. The forensic examination of the original manuscript actually showed that Diana spent several hours formatting this warning. The reverse side of the page has multiple corrections where she scratched out initial sentences and replaced them with more precise, legally binding language. She was making sure that if this document was ever retrieved during a future family crisis, palace attorneys couldn't dismiss it as an emotional outburst. She was building a legal record. But here's the detail that apparently sent a fresh wave of panic through Buckingham Palace on Thursday morning. In the middle of the second page, Diana referenced a secret personal repository containing over 200 original letters and diary entries from her school days and early marriage. She told Anne she had hidden this repository completely outside the palace infrastructure, entirely separate from the royal archives at Windsor Castle, and she instructed her personal trustees to release the entire archive to the public if the central administration ever attempted to completely block her access to her sons following the upcoming autumn term. So there's potentially a vault somewhere, possibly in Fleet Street, according to some reports, containing 200 documents that Diana specifically set aside as an insurance policy. The King's legal teams are apparently working through the night trying to track the movement of Spencer family holdings from that era to locate this vault before anything else surfaces. That's not a comfortable position for the palace to be in. The letter ends with a postscript that Diana added just before sealing the envelope. She wrote that she was leaving for the Mediterranean the following morning with a deep sense of administrative anxiety, feeling that her time to secure her son's emotional safety was rapidly running out. 3 weeks later, she was dead. That postscript transforms this document from a piece of family correspondence into something that reads like a final testament. Now let's talk about Princess Anne's side of this, because what she did with this letter for 30 years is honestly remarkable. She kept her copy in a fireproof military-grade combination, safe-bolted into the stone wall of her private study at Gatcombe Park, hidden beneath layers of equestrian breeding logs and family land titles. That safe remained completely untouched by any palace assistant or household surveyor for exactly 3 decades. Through every documentary, every memoir, every leaked tape recording sold to international broadcasters for millions of pounds, Anne gave 0 interviews. She authorized 0 press statements. She kept that letter locked away, and she said absolute.
For 30 years, one royal woman was called cold, the other was called beloved, and when the full record finally came together, it turned out the label was backwards. Princess Anne spent decades being described in the British press as brisk, unsentimental, allergic to emotion, the opposite of her sister-in-law Diana, who cried on camera, hugged strangers, and turned vulnerability into a kind of public art form. That contrast became one of the most repeated storylines in modern royal history. Diana was warmth, Anne was steel. It was simple, it was visual, and it sold newspapers for the better part of 2 decades. But when you actually trace what Princess Anne did in the days, months, and years after Diana's death in August 1997, a very different picture starts to form. One where the woman accused of having no feelings was one of the steadiest, quietest sources of protection 2 grieving boys had. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to how the Diana Anne dynamic was actually built in the public imagination in the first place. Biographer Andrew Morton, whose 1992 book Diana, her true story, was based on secretly recorded tapes Diana herself supplied through her friend James Colthist, painted a portrait of a young princess who felt isolated inside an institution that didn't know what to do with her. Sally Bedell Smith, in her biography Diana in Search of Herself, described a woman who never fully found her footing among the family she married into, whose emotional openness clashed constantly with a household built around restraint. Neither book paints Anne as a villain, but the wider tabloid ecosystem of the 1980s and 90s ran with the contrast anyway, because it made a clean story. The fashionable, fragile princess against the tough, practical princess royal, who reportedly had little patience for what she saw as excessive sentimentality. That framing hardened into common knowledge, repeated in documentary after documentary, without much room for the possibility that it was incomplete. The real test of that narrative came on the last weekend of August 1997, in circumstances nobody in that family could have prepared for. Diana died in a car crash in Paris in the early hours of August 31st. William was 15. Harry was 12. Both boys were with their father and grandparents at Balmoral Castle in Scotland when the news broke, and what happened next became one of the most scrutinized decisions in modern royal history. The choice, made by Queen Elizabeth II, to keep the boys at Balmoral rather than bring them immediately to London, where a wave of public grief was building outside the palace gates that the monarchy had never seen before and didn't fully know how to read. At the time, that decision was hammered by the press. The absence of a flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, the family's silence, the sense that the institution was hiding rather than mourning, all of it fed a public fury that nearly became a crisis for the monarchy itself. Tony Blair, then the new Prime Minister, reportedly pushed hard behind the scenes for the family to show more visible emotion. The pressure was enormous, and for years, that week was told almost entirely as a story about institutional failure. What's often left out is what Princess and actually said about it decades later, when she was finally asked directly. In a 2017 interview with ITV News royal editor Chris Shipp, recorded before her mother's death and released publicly after, and defended the decision in plain, unpolished language that had nothing performative about it, she said of William and Harry, "I don't think either of those two would have been able to cope if they'd been anywhere else." She went on to describe the structure Balmoral gave them. People who understood, time to process, even in the briefest way possible, distance from a media storm neither boy had the tools to face at 15 and 12 years old. It's a small quote, but it tells you something important, that inside a family being torn apart publicly for its coldness, and was one of the people arguing, in private, that the boys needed protection from exposure, not more of it. That instinct didn't disappear once the funeral ended. Prince Harry, in his 2023 memoir Spare, described those days at Balmoral in stark terms, writing about the eerie stillness of the castle in the aftermath, the sense of being suspended in a kind of holding pattern, while the world outside spun into a grief nobody in the family fully anticipated. He wrote about routines continuing almost mechanically, about silence where there should have been conversation. It's not a flattering picture of how the family communicated in that moment, and Harry doesn't pretend otherwise. But it does confirm something the ITV interview also suggested, that whatever was happening emotionally inside Balmoral's walls that week, it was happening away from cameras, away from statements, away from anything designed for public consumption. Anne's later defense of that instinct is consistent with a woman who believed privacy, however criticized from outside, was itself a form of care. The relationship didn't end with that week either. William and Harry's cousin Zara Tyndall, Anne's daughter, became one of the closest relationships either brother had within their own generation of the family. Royal biographer Brian Hoey has described Zara as effectively the closest cousin William and Harry had growing up, a relationship that continued through their 20s and into adulthood, visible in things as ordinary as family skiing trips and as public as royal engagements where the cousins were photographed together, clearly at ease. That closeness didn't happen by accident. It reflects a branch of the family, Anne's branch, that stayed embedded in William and Harry's lives long after the cameras stopped focusing on the tragic princess storyline and moved on to other things. There's also the matter of how differently Anne herself was covered once people actually started paying attention to what she does rather than how she presents. Royal commentators have increasingly referred to Anne as the hardest working royal in Britain, a reputation built on decades of engagements carried out with almost no public relations campaign behind them. No memoirs, no televised sit-down interviews about her inner life, no attempt to reshape her image after years of being cast as the family's least emotionally available member. She simply kept working, kept showing up, and let the reputation shift slowly on its own, entirely on the evidence of what she actually did rather than what she said about herself. That's a meaningfully different model of royal life than the one Diana was forced into, where visibility and emotional openness became the currency of public sympathy, and chose the opposite currency, consistency without commentary. And for a long time, that read to outside observers as coldness, simply because it didn't perform the way the culture expected grief and care to look. Prince William's own words, in the 2017 ITV documentary Diana, 7 Days, add another layer to this. He spoke about how torn his grandmother felt during that period, caught between being a grandmother to 2 grieving boys and a monarch responsible for reading a nation's mood. He described being grateful, in hindsight, for the privacy Balmoral gave him and Harry to process what had happened before having to put on their prince hats, as Harry phrased it in the same documentary, and resume public duties. Neither brother, in that documentary or in the years since, singled out and specifically for the kind of quiet protection this piece is describing. But the through line across every credible account, Morton's biography, Bedell, Smith's biography, the ITV interview, Spare, the 2017 documentary, is remarkably consistent. The family's protective instinct in